This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 63 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, August 17th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenegel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, Joseph Smith goes on a smear campaign against the POTUS, Martin Van Buren. Joe claims that his dog is more fit to run the country than Van Buren is, likely giving him the confidence as well as the social clout to run for president in the 1844 election. After that, Joe introduces baptisms for the dead, necromancy, and the waters of the Mississippi in commerce were continually troubled by people getting dunked for loved ones. We wrap up the historical portion with discussing just how much John C. Bennett influenced Joe throughout his short time with the Saints. After that, we bring on an old friend, Kaitlyn McKenna, to see how she's been doing for the past 2 years since we last spoke after she was kicked out of her parents' house and was forced to start a GoFundMe campaign for basic living essentials because she didn't agree with the church's teachings. Let's get into it. Last episode, we began with Elias Higbee and his advocacy in behalf of the Mormons to the Congressional Committee as they were about to deliver their verdict of kicking the Mormon problem back down to the state level in Missouri. The Mormons would receive no redress for the wrongs perpetrated against them in Missouri, but Joe, now back in Commerce, Illinois, handling church affairs, wasn't aware of this yet. Joe continued to collect affidavits from select Mormons who would tell their side of the story. In the end, Joe totaled up the bill to the government at a whopping $1,381,044. That's the equivalent of $38.12 million today. The number was resoundingly rejected by the government, and Elias Higbee was sent packing. And after we discussed that, we talked about how sickly Sidney Rigdon was during this time, and how little he was able to contribute when the Mormons needed him the most. The Quorum of the 12 boarded a ship for England and continued to petition Joe to release the copyright on the Book of Mormon so they could begin circulating Mormon literature to the unwashed masses in England. Finally, we introduced a person who will have a dramatic impact on the historical timeline. After a brief letter exchange in the summer of 1840, Quartermaster General of Illinois, John C. Bennett, joined our timeline under the nickname of John Broke It, because of his incredible ability to bend things to his will till they hit the breaking point. That's just a little milk for today. Let's partake of some meat.
As the scriptures say, they must have milk before meat.
Joe felt pretty burned by his recent scrape with the government. He spared no opportunity to speak out against the apathy of the government or about the president in particular. He did call Martin Van Buren a fop or a fool, but that was only the beginning of his tirade against the president. In reference to his journey back to commerce from Washington, this is from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, page 72. Quote, having witnessed many vexatious movements in government officers whose sole object should be the peace and prosperity and happiness of the whole people, but instead of this, I discovered that popular clamor and personal aggrandizement were the ruling principles of those in authority, And my heart faints within me when I see by the visions of the Almighty the end of this nation, if she continues to disregard the cries and petitions of her virtuous citizens, as she has done and is now doing. On my way home, I did not fail to proclaim the iniquity and insolence of Martin Van Buren towards myself and an injured people, which will have its effect upon the public mind. And he may never be elected again to any office of trust or power by which he may abuse the innocent and let the guilty go free." End quote. That was putting things lightly. The Quincy Whig would publish Joe's actual opinions from an interview that they conducted, and it was published on October 17th, 1840. And it says as follows, quote, "Before he," meaning Joseph Smith, "had heard the story of our wrongs," said the indignant prophet, "Mr. Van Buren gave us to understand that he could do nothing for the redress of our grievances, lest it should interfere with his political prospects in Missouri. He is not as fit," said he, "as my dog for the chair of state. For my dog will make an effort to protect his abused and insulted master, while the present chief magistrate will not so much as lift a finger to relieve an oppressed and persecuted community of freemen, whose glory it has been that they were citizens of the United States." End quote. 1840 was actually a pretty contested election, and Joe coming out publicly against Martin Van Buren really didn't help his numbers in the upcoming election. Van Buren thought that he had his next term all sealed up, but the Whig Party pulled a clutch move, and somehow an unprecedented 80% of voters turned out, and William Henry Harrison, known as the hero of Tippecanoe, who may have slain Tecumseh, pulled in 53% of the popular vote, only to be president for another unprecedented 1 month before he died from a cold. Now, Martin Van Buren had been president during a number of unpopular occurrences, such as the Panic of 1837 and denying the annexation of Texas, which Andrew Jackson had put into place before he left office. This, along with a number of other things, just helped Joe's public campaign in showing how unfit to lead the country Van Buren was, which all culminated in Harris's election of 1840. It should be noted that Joe meeting with President Van Buren may have contributed to Joe's own aspirations of running for office in the 1844 election with Sidney Rigdon as his running mate. Now, let's face it. When a person is in a position of power like the President of the United States, it may seem like an ethereal or unattainable concept, like some kind of superhuman is the only person who's able to deal with all of the pressures of running a country, right? But once Joe actually met Van Buren in person, he realized that the POTUS was just a regular dude who looked like an anthropomorphic bowl of jelly, and anybody could do his job, including Joe's dog. Joe was too late to join the 1840 presidential race, but that does mean that he had time to prepare himself mentally and socially to run for the 1844 race. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's jump back into the summer of 1840 here. There exists a doctrinal addition, which makes its way into church practices around August and September of 1840. Now, this addition marks another doctrine taught by Joe which was previously unknown, but has somehow survived to church practices in some form today. We've discussed this before, but Joe's Mormonism is a bit different than the Mormonism practiced by the Brighamites in Utah. Most of Bloody Brigham's teachings derived from something that Joe taught, but most of those teachings came about in the Nauvoo years. The Ohio years of Mormonism was the light version. But what sets Mormonism apart from most other Christianities today came about in Nauvoo, and one of those teachings is necromancy, called Ordinances for the Dead. Back in the Kirtland Temple, Joe and Ollie, in my opinion, tripped for a couple of hours, and they saw a pantheon of angels, and Joe later claimed that he had seen his brother Alvin, who had died around 1823, without being baptized into the one true church, which Joe had found 7 years after Alvin's death. This troubled Joe because he taught that babies who hadn't been baptized were saved, but that said nothing about those who'd crossed into the age of reason at age 8, because they were accountable for their sins, but they couldn't be saved without being baptized and confirmed into the Mormon religion. Thus, the idea of baptisms for the dead was born. Now, the actual beginning of baptisms for the dead becoming part of church doctrine owes itself to a single occurrence, even though Joe had been toying with the idea for quite some time prior to this occurrence. According to H. Michael Marquardt in The Rise of Mormonism, no record exists of the actual occasion where Joe introduced baptisms for the dead. However, there exists a letter exchange between Heber C. Kimball, then in England on his mission with the Quorum of the 12, and his wife Violet, where Violet tells about the situation. This is taken from The Rise of Mormonism, starting with page 536. Quote, Smith also saw that all children who die before they arrive to the years of accountability are saved in the celestial kingdom of heaven. In 1840, this would change with the introduction of a new doctrine, baptisms for the dead. Living in Nauvoo, Violet Kimball wrote to her husband Heber in England. Now this is quoting from Violet, quote, Seymour Brunson is dead. A short time before he died, he told Joseph not to hold him any longer, for, said he, I have seen David Patton, that was Captain Fearnought, who died in a scrape in 1838 in Missouri, and he wants me, and the Lord wants me, and I want to go. Back to the Rise of Mormonism. Joseph Smith preached the funeral sermon of Brunson and presented the topic of baptisms for the dead on August 15, 1840, end quote. So that letter from Violet Kimball was sent on September 6, 1840, which that actually marks the official introduction of this subsect of necromancy into church doctrine. The effects were profound, which Violet Kimball tells of in another letter to her husband that was written about a month later, and I'm reading this from later on in The Rise of Mormonism by Marquardt. From Violet Kimball, quote, President Smith has opened a new and glorious subject of late, which has caused quite a revival in the church. That is, being baptized for the dead. Paul speaks of it in 1 Corinthians 15th chapter 29th verse. Joseph has received a more full explanation of it by revelation. He says it is the privilege of this church to be baptized for all their kinsfolk who have died before this gospel came forth, even back to their grandfather and mother if they have been personally acquainted with them, and given them the privilege of coming forth in the first resurrection. He says they will have the gospel preached to them in prison, but there is no such thing as spirits being baptized. From later on in the letter, since the order has been preached here, the waters have been continually troubled. During conferences, there were sometimes from 8 to 10 elders in the river at a time baptizing. I want to be baptized for my mother. I calculated to wait until you come home, but the last time Joseph spoke upon the subject, he advised everyone to be up and doing and liberate their friends from bondage as quick as possible. So I think I shall go forward this week, as there is a number of neighbors going forward. Some have already been baptized a number of times over. They have been baptized and confirmed for one person before they can be baptized for another. Those that have no friends on the earth to be baptized for them can send ministering spirits to whomsoever they will and make known their requests. Thus, you can see there is a chance for all. Is this not a glorious doctrine? Surely the Gentiles will mock, but we will rejoice in it. End quote. Let's discuss just briefly how this slightly differs from today's necromancy in the church, okay? This was before the temple endowment ceremony was even a thing, but the Mormons recognized a need for baptizing those who'd passed away before joining the church, and thus they implemented baptism and confirmation for the dead. From how Violet describes it, back then they would get baptized and confirmed for one person, and then they would go back in the water and be baptized and then come out and be confirmed for another over and over, performing the ordinance for one name at a time. They could also just be baptized and confirmed with a blank name and then send it off to whoever might need it. Those two details differ from how baptisms for the dead are done today. Now, this is only anecdotal from my experience, so take that for what it's worth, but I think this is pretty standard. When a person does baptisms for the dead today, they show up to the temple and then they change into their whites. And after that, you go into a chapel waiting room where 2 elders confirm you with like 10 or 20 or however many names you're doing that day, and they just say the same confirmation prayer every time, and they just change out the name, reading it off of a screen. But a person can't be confirmed before they're baptized. even though the confirmations are usually done first just for efficiency's sake. So the 10 or 20 names you're confirmed for are different than the 10 or 20 names you'll be baptized for after you've been confirmed. Once you're done being confirmed for those names, then that's when you go into the baptismal font area where they have the pool that's held up by the golden oxen, and that's when you get dunked 10 or 20 times for a bunch of different names. None of them are the names that you were confirmed for previously. After that, you get out of the water with the hopes that nothing is showing through your, soaked white clothes that you're wearing, and then you go into the locker room, change back into your Sunday clothes, and then that's the end of the ordinance. But the point is, you don't have to get baptized and confirmed for one person at a time now, as Violet described here. And also, you can't just write like a blank baptism and confirmation check like she described for whoever might need it, like they were practicing in Nauvoo. Imagine that. The church has streamlined the process of necromancy just for efficiency. And they did that by changing how an ordinance was done when the ordinance was originally introduced by Joseph Smith. Imagine that. So as we progress further into 1840 and we begin to crack into 1841, John Cook Bennett begins to exhibit his influence in many ways. Now, it's arguable that no other man had a greater impact on Mormon history with respect to the amount of time that he spent with the Mormons. The 21 months from August of 1840 to May of 1842 marked an incredible time in shifting Mormon doctrine and clandestine operations lurking beneath the public face, all put forward by Joe and the other leadership of the church. And, I have to say, possibly my favorite trait about John C. Bennett, or, John Brockett as we know him, is that he embraced and practiced every one of Joe's guilty pleasures. And he did so in such an unabashed and unapologetic way that it utterly defies logic. Upon his vicious and public removal from Mormonism, the finger-pointing by Brockett aimed at Joe, and of course vice versa, was something out of a daytime soap opera that the Mormons were living out in real time. Joe was on a high when Brockett first got to Nauvoo and things began to finally resemble the structure that Joe had in Kirtland. With the exception of those pesky people like the Whitmers, Ollie Cowdung, and Hinchpin Rigdon trying to steal the throne or, add their ideas superior to Joe's. Finally, at this time in late 1840, Joe was surrounded by yes men. He had excised any naysayers. This euphoria was captured by Violet Kimball, who we read from earlier. And this was a letter that she wrote to her husband. Quote, "Our people had bought a boat. They have named her Nauvoo. The last trip she made up the river, President Smith went with her, and when he returned, who should accompany him but John F. Boynton and his wife, and Lyman Johnson. They made it their home to Joseph Smith's all the time they were here. I never saw Joseph appear more happy. Said he, I am going to have all my old friends around me again. They both bought lots and calculate to build and move here the ensuing season. As to their faith, I have not heard much about it, but I conclude they have got some, or they would have no object in coming here. I never saw anybody that appeared gladder to me than John's wife. They all called brother and sister and appeared as friendly as I ever saw them! ! End quote. And that was read from The Rise of Mormonism by H. Michael Marquardt, page 512. But just as everything ebbs and flows, this time of euphoria was going to eventually come to an end. But while this euphoria existed, Joe was going to enjoy it to the utmost of his ability. And in the October of 1840 conference, there are some marked, very interesting developments in Mormonism, both in the official record and in journal accounts left behind looking back in reflection. And in those journal accounts, that's where the real stories live. It was during this conference that Joe and Brockett teamed up to construct the charter for Nauvoo for approval by Governor Thomas Carlin of Illinois, which would give Nauvoo validation as a legitimate city, and also sanction the Nauvoo Legion, the government militia. This was a necessary step along the steps of development for the Saints. Previously, they had settled in Kirtland, which was already a legitimate city with thousands of inhabitants. But after that, they moved out to Missouri and began grouping together in small communes, practicing the law of consecration, usually never bothering with the formalities of applying for official village or town charters through the Missouri government. And it's hard to believe that the Missouri government would approve the majority of these settlement requests, as their prejudices against the Saints likely would have caused them to, lose the paperwork or something like that. But in this time in Illinois, Joe was careful to carry out the foundation of Nauvoo by the books, never ignoring neither jot nor tittle of any law required to legally settle thousands of people in a given area. And, this provides a stark contrast between what happened in Missouri versus how the Saints were approaching Nauvoo. And another stark contrast between their plan in Missouri and Illinois is their purchase of massive swaths of land to sanction as primarily Mormon settlements. Joe had purchased tens of thousands of acres from White and Galland for the Mormons to settle upon, instead of just squatting, like the majority of the Mormons had done when they were settling in Missouri. Joe didn't want to be chased from Illinois, like he'd been from New York, Ohio, and Missouri prior to this, so he was making friends with people in high places. White and Galland were the beginning, but Governor Thomas Carland, and there were, a bunch of other public officials, they were all being treated overly commodious by the Mormons to attempt to win favor in the public eye. And John Brockett was actually one of these motivated guys with a high public office of Quartermaster General of Illinois, so Joe fast-tracked Brockett for success among the church's elite. But Brockett was by no means destitute when he moved to Commerce, okay? And Commerce was actually soon to be designated Nauvoo. I'm using those words interchangeably here. So in August or earlier September, that's when he got there. But for whatever reason, he chose to take up residence in the humble Smith abode for nearly 9 months upon first arriving, before he built his own house. And we'll get into some of the public changes in doctrine and practice that the Mormon Church emplaced with John Brockett's influence, but there are some influences which are much harder to quantify when we discuss one person's influence on Joe and church doctrine. Now, what I mean by that is, the church began to practice polygamy, temple rituals, baptisms for the dead, masonry, and a number of other important doctrinal developments once Brockett began to influence Joe. Now, I'm not by any means saying that all of these were John Bennett's ideas. I think that he just kind of gave Joe the confidence needed to begin officially practicing these esoteric doctrines. What I'm talking about is much more subtle and immeasurable. John Brockett began living with Joe and was quickly inducted into the church hierarchy faster than basically anybody had up to that point. But just try for yourself to picture how much he influenced Joe in the smallest of ways every single way. This is a quick diversion to just illustrate my point. At Sunstone Symposium back in July, Christopher Smith posed his hypothesis that Joseph Smith didn't ever want to found a religion when the Book of Mormon was being printed. He was just trying to make some money from the book to pull the Smith family out of destitution. Over the period of months, Ollie Cowdung, as we know him, that's Oliver Cowdery, was able to convince Joe that the best way to make money was to become a revered preacher and build up a following. Through hundreds of daily conversations on the topic, Joe finally relented to Ollie's musings and agreed to found the Mormon religion. And then on April 6, 1830, Mormonism became a thing, thanks in no small part to our good friend Ollie. The point is, Joe was a fluid guy, and he could be convinced to do something or embrace a doctrine based on subtle pushes through good argumentation over the span of multiple conversations. Every one of those conversations that Joe and Ollie had influenced Joe, and they moved him closer to doing something he wouldn't have done otherwise. John Brockett and Joe lived in the same house for 9 months. Imagine how much time they spent conversing while eating food at the same table. Imagine how many late-night conversations they shared after their wives had long since retired to their respective beds. Now, just try to think of yourself as a fly on the wall when Joe and Brockett were talking about the religious justification for polygamy for hours on end. Joe would talk about the Song of Solomon and how his and Rigdon's translation of the Bible essentially wrote off the whole thing. Joe might tell of the passage from Jacob 2 in the Book of Mormon, where it says explicitly that polygamy is condemned by God. But then Elder Bennett would come back by telling Brother Joseph that God commanded Abraham to have 2 wives to raise progeny. But Joseph, if it's wrong for a man to love more than his spouse, why would God make us attracted to others? If it feels right, it must be the Spirit intimating that the Lord approves of such behavior. God wants us to be happy in our mortal coil. We are enlightened men. We shouldn't be constrained by the dictates of an older generation. Jesus said that people of this world are married, and all are one in him. It was Paul who shaped the great and abominable version of marriage and the place of men and women in society. Shouldn't we be free to submit to the promptings of our own spirits? What is it you're saying, Brother Bennett? I'm saying, brother, that we should do what it is that makes us truly happy, and the Lord will tell us that it is good in his eyes. Of course, after that, the men finished their conversation, and they retired to their beds to ponder the conversation and let their dreams take them into a world beyond. The next morning, while their wives bustle about, Bennett and Smith silently exchange knowing glances across the breakfast table. They know what each other is thinking, but their thoughts don't need words to be exchanged, of course, in the company of their wives. They have much to discuss, but it can wait until they're alone again. There's always time. You see, there's no way to quantify the influence that John Brockett had on Joe. They spent hundreds of hours per month together with a constant open exchange of ideas, and they were truly inseparable at this time. There's no way Joe could know what was in store for him and the church in a mere 2 years' time. Let's get to some of the changes that the church made once Brockett teamed up with Joe and began to infect him with his free love ideals that were contrary to the good, singular man and wife constructs of the majority of Christianity at the time. A man named Joseph Bates Noble, who had been a member of the church for quite some time prior to Brockett's involvement, left an affidavit in 1869, and it gives us a window into how much the church was changing upon Brockett's arrival. This is taken from Marquardt's Rise of Mormonism, page 557, quoting directly from Noble's affidavit. Quote, "In the fall of the year A.D. 1840, Joseph Smith taught him, meaning Noble, the principle of celestial marriage, or a plurality of wives, and that the said Joseph Smith declared that he had received a revelation from God on the subject, and that the angel of the Lord had commanded him to move forward in the said order of marriage." End quote. It doesn't include the actual text of the revelation, but the revelation would later be canonized into Doctrine and Covenants section 132 after Joe's death, because the revelation was kept under wraps and it was only shared among the elite in the church who were granted license to practice polygamy during Joe's life. But once they got out to Utah and Brigham was running hog wild, the revelation became canonized. It was on the other side of this winter of 1840 to 1841 that Joseph Noble performed the first official sealing ceremony for Joe and his first official polygamist wife, Louisa Beeman. That was in early April of 1841. Changes definitely accelerate with the inclusion of Brockett's agenda into church policy, polygamy being one of his main contributions. Now, that's not to say that polygamy was solely John Bennett's idea. Joe had been involved with women other than Emma for years before he knew Brockett, but it took Brockett coming along and being there to enshrine these loopholes into church doctrine. I'll tell you this, okay? A lot of Mormon break-off sects consider the Nauvoo years to be when Joe kind of went off the rails and he let his natural man take over. Some of these sects don't follow any of the revelations which were given in Nauvoo, and they just stick to the Church of Christ revelations that were delivered in Kirtland. And, I actually don't blame them. There's a lot of shit that happened in Missouri and Nauvoo that may lead one to believe that Joe somehow lost his, divine connection or his piety. When Joe was in Kirtland, his actions were often tempered by public perceptions. If he stepped too far out of line with what most people considered the actions of a prophet of God, in air quotes, the people quickly would and often did forsake him and the entire Mormon ministry. Once we get to Missouri, Joe is suddenly thrust into a world where dissenters and naysayers are chased from town at the end of the Danites' pitchforks and muskets. His brief year in Missouri marked a turning point for Joe, which culminated in his assassination in 1844. But once he escaped from jail and began to build Nauvoo from scratch, that was his clean slate. He thought himself untouchable, meaning a number of things which were, taboo and off the table could be reasonably considered, provided that they were implemented correctly. The reason that I bring this up is because I think it's important to ask exactly when Joe lost his, abilities as prophet. And what occasion caused such a thing to be lost from his grasp, okay? The Joseph Smith, in my head, never was any sort of prophet. A spiritual leader? Absolutely. A businessman constrained by his own vices? Undoubtedly. But a prophet? Nothing Joseph Smith ever did in his life leads me to believe he was a prophet or he had any prophetic abilities, whatever those might be. Contrary to what we might consider a prophet, Joe couldn't foresee any major calamity which may befall him or the Mormons. He didn't foretell of any major world event. The only thing that makes him fill the role of prophet is that he claimed to be speaking as God. He led most of his personal revelations with lines such as, "I am the Lord thy God," and "Thus saith the Lord, the Alpha and Omega," stuff like that. But anybody can do that. In order to be a prophet, you have to be prophetic in some way. If Joe was a prophet, why could he not foresee what lay in store for him with John Bennett? Bennett broke it. He broke the system. Brockett was a self-driven, egocentric man who wouldn't let any inconvenience befall him for longer than he could stand. When Joe became inconvenient to what Brockett desired, he took it as a personal mission to destroy Joe and the Mormons. How could the one true prophet of God not foresee such a calamity that lie in wait? Bennett is one of the primary reasons why some believe that Joe lost his prophetic abilities somewhere along the way and was leading the saints in Illinois as nothing but a man. I don't much care for those conversations because I see materialism and naturalistic explanations for anything and everything that befell Joe. But it is important to some that Joseph Smith was a prophet ordained with divine providence from the mighty above. But I would argue that a true prophet, whatever that may be, should be able to foresee somebody like Brockett coming along who nearly destroyed the very foundation of the church. I was struck with this same surprise upon reading a link that was posted in the Ex-Mormon Reddit, and it linked to an article in the December 12th, 1936 issue of the Latter-day Saints Millennial Star. Now, I don't take anything I see on Reddit for granted, so I had to chase it down and look for the actual paper, and I found it. And I'm just going to read a brief excerpt, as I think it is pertinent to the topic of the power of prophecy, or lack thereof, when it comes to the Mormon religion. Basically, this is from, 1936. It begins with discussing the problems which were befalling the world with the recent resurgence of secularism since the Bolshevik Revolution and the foundation of the Soviet Union. Then it poses the increase of secularism and the dissolution of Christian morality as two central problems, and it looks for a solution. And their solution is just priceless. Quote, "Is it not pertinent to ask what has brought about the changes described in the first two paragraphs quoted above? We think one very important factor, perhaps the major one, is chargeable to the professional Christian ministry in America. Yeah, that's the problem. Professional Christian ministry. Yeah, paid pastors. After that, it poses 3 traits which are seen as admirable. Okay? Are not deep conviction, number 1, genuine sincerity, number 2, and real enthusiasm, number 3, absolutely necessary on the part of those, particularly in these days, who would successfully lead any worthy cause? It was recently said by a very well-informed lecturer that Herr Hitler has an abundance of these 3 qualities. How can one develop faith who has no faith? Assumed enthusiasm will not long pass for the genuine article with an intelligent clientele. End quote. Yes, that was the problem with the world in the late 1930s. People didn't have enough conviction, sincerity, or enthusiasm. And it's a good thing that Herr Hitler came along and just cured the world of all their apathy. This was published in the 1936 church periodical, The Millennial Star. Okay? Now, granted, this analogy of like the lack of prophetic ability is by no means perfect. Okay? John Brockett wasn't Hitler. And accusations of polygamy and coordinated assassinations don't really equivocate to over 50 million dead people. But my point is much simpler than that, and the analogy doesn't break down if we don't examine the nuance of it. My point is, why can't prophets foresee calamity? If a prophet is good for anything, shouldn't that be seeing dangers that await their followers? The LDS Church, supposedly led by a team of 15 prophets, seers, and revelators, couldn't see Hitler coming in 1936 any more than Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of the Mormon religion, could see how troubled his own life would be when he took John Bennett under his roof and became disturbingly close friends with him. I guess the overall takeaway is Mormonism was never a religion led by a prophet. Not in the 19th century, not in the 20th century, and definitely not today. Alrighty, what you're about to listen to is going to be an interview that I did with Kaitlyn McKenna. I describe it in the interview pretty well, but essentially Kaitlyn came on the show back in October of 2015 because she needed some help from the secular community, and the secular community stepped up to the plate and helped her out. So this is the follow-up interview that I conducted just this last week to see how she's done since she got the help from the secular community and they created that safety net for her. Without further ado, this is my interview with Kaitlyn McKenna. Today we are joined by a very special guest. Back in October of 2015, I had on somebody named Kaitlyn McKenna, who had recently gone through a little bit of trouble in her household. This is back to Special Edition Episode 12, and she needed some help and ran a Kickstarter campaign, a GoFundMe campaign, in order to help with some living expenses. And at the end of that episode, I promised that we would follow up in a year's time, and now almost 2 years later, Kaitlyn is back with us to join us. So Kaitlyn, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for coming back after much ado. I had gotten in a couple of emails of people asking, hey, did you ever follow up with Kaitlyn? And I was ashamed to say that I hadn't, remembering that I had told everybody I was going to follow up with you in a year. So here we are now. Kaitlyn, for people who are, new listeners who may not have heard that special edition episode 12, can you tell people kind of what went down 2 years ago and a little bit, maybe give us a Cliff Notes version of what happened?
So about 3 years ago, I moved out to Salt Lake City for the first time, moved away from high school. And about a year or so later, I actually had to move back in with my family because my mental health was not the best it could be. And I was in a really bad place, in a really bad situation. So I moved back in with my family. They are Mormon. I was raised Mormon, and I'm now an atheist. And so moved back in with my family, and it kind of started, they started to, kind of make me go to church, and I wasn't really happy about that. I was working 2 full-time jobs, trying to save money so I could leave again. And it was just really a bad situation. One day they just got really mad about a bunch of different stuff, I guess, and decided that they would kick me out. They told me I had a week. And so I started panicking, and that's when I set up the GoFundMe. Well, my parents found it. My dad came down to my bedroom that night and told me I had to be out the next day. And so I moved out. My boyfriend came out, picked me up from Roosevelt. It's about a 3-hour drive from Salt Lake City, and drove me out. And I lived with the lady that took me in until I could find my feet again and find my place again. And so that was awesome.
No kidding. And this was all 2 years ago. So obviously quite a bit has happened since then. And it sounds like you've kind of been thrust into the real world. So tell me a little bit how things are going now.
Things are really going great now. I have a job that I love, and it's turning into more of a career for me. I'm starting classes again in the fall to work on my psychology degree, and just living in Salt Lake City and making friends and enjoying life.
That's really cool. And of course, the most pertinent question that I want to ask is, how have things kind of developed with your family? Because, don't feel like you need to share this or anything, but I feel like it's kind of important to ask how your relationship has developed, because obviously 2 years ago, you weren't on the best of terms with the family.
It has gotten a lot better. I didn't see my family for about 6 months after that happened. And wow. The next time I saw them, it was actually because my uncle passed away. And so I saw them at his funeral. And I didn't talk to them a lot there. My mom gave me a big hug, and then that was about it.
Wow.
But I stayed with my boyfriend's family, and I have every time I've gone out to visit. Since then, things have gotten a lot better, though. I've gotten a lot closer with my family. I think the turning point was my sister. My older sister got married about a year or so ago, about 2 years ago. And she actually recently had a baby. And so this has been kind of the turning point, I think, for my parents' relationship with me. I think that my sister having a baby helped them realize that they don't want to have a bad relationship with me, because they're grandparents now, and I'm eventually going to have kids, and they're going to want to be in their lives. And so our relationship has greatly improved.
That's really good to hear. Do you still, so I know that initially kind of a bit of the arguments that were coming up were a little bit about church and about you attending church or not attending, and they were kind of having issues with that. Have you spoken with them much about church, or is that kind of one of those taboo topics? We get together, we just don't talk about that. How is that treated?
I think that you're right. It's one of those things we just don't really address when we're together. And yeah. I mean, my boyfriend's grandmother is very religious as well. And she'll kind of make comments here and there, but we let it pass because it's Nana. But I think my family, we've gotten to the point where it's like, we're just not going to discuss this because it's just not worth the potential argument.
Yeah, and, it seems like a lot of ex-Mormons kind of make their way through family get-togethers that way. Yeah. It's like, as long as we keep that topic off the table, nobody's going to get in a fight, and we can all part with, hugs and kisses and saying we look forward to seeing you at Thanksgiving and whatnot. So.
Oh, exactly. And all my dad's siblings are ex-Mormon. And so I feel like he's gotten he knows that this is something that they just have to avoid talking about from his own experience.
No kidding. Well, let me kind of take that as a jump off point. Do you know how your parents, obviously if they're surrounded by ex-Mos and even their own daughter is an ex-Mo atheist, do you think that do you think that's caused them to take pause at their beliefs or caused them to think about or examine their beliefs at all? Or is that something you have no idea about?
Well, I actually think it's opposite. I think it's gotten them to hold on stronger.
Oh, wow.
I think that they kind of pride themselves in being the only members of my dad's family left that is really strongly Mormon and not ex-Mormon. And so, they're all very active in the church. My dad is in the bishopric and everything. And so I think that caused them. I know there was a time in my life when I was younger that my parents weren't going to church a lot. My dad was working really long hours, and so on Sundays he just wanted to relax. But when he almost wasn't able to baptize my sister, my older sister, then that kind of scared him and got him back in. And so I think that's been the only time that they've really not taken church too seriously.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, one thing that that the church does tend to have a powerful hold on is the sense of community, right? When you go to church, you're going to see all of your family members there. You're going to see your neighbors, all of the people, the home teachers who will come and help you move or come help with yard work and stuff. They build this entire community that happens to be centered around the religion. But unfortunately, there really isn't much of an analog to that. There isn't a secular version. There isn't an atheist church really that we can go to have that sense of community. So I kind of want to ask you, Kaitlyn, have you found a way into a kind of a central community where you feel like you can connect with people in this way? And if so, what might that be? So
a few different notes on that. One of the things that actually happened 2 years ago as all this was going on is I got back in touch with a guy that I knew in high school as a friend of Tristan and mine. Tristan being my boyfriend. And he had no idea that I had left the church. He had as well. And so he got back in contact with me, got back in touch. He had no idea that all this was happening. Felt really, a lot of sympathy. And so since then, we've actually become very close friends. And he's also an atheist, also ex-Mormon. And so That was awesome to get back in touch with someone that understands what it's like. I'm also in quite a few Facebook groups that have either post-Mormons or atheists, and, it's a great support group. Even if we don't meet a lot, in person, it's great to have people to turn to, people to ask, people to talk to, about anything that I can think of.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think that's kind of the point too, is like, there are meetups and stuff. There are like hangouts that some ex-Mormon groups and atheist groups and stuff will have, but nothing that's kind of like systematized on a regular basis where, every Sunday you come together. Some of them will do like a coffee meetup once a month. And those are really, really cool. And I think those are, if people are looking for that sense of community, that's one really good way to get a hold of it. But it's also not in a, massive chapel with, 250 other people or whatever. It's just, 10 or 15 people meeting at a coffee shop, which is great, but unfortunately it does kind of point out the disparity between the infrastructure that the church has constructed versus the infrastructure that the secular community has yet to build to kind of create the meeting groups for those people.
Oh yeah, especially in Utah. I mean, the atheists that you meet, there's few and far between. There's very few atheists in the community. Salt Lake City, I feel, is a bit more secular, a bit more liberal in that aspect. Yeah. But in Utah in general, it's very uncommon to come across someone that's also atheist, also, believing the same things that you do. Whereas, I mean, when I was growing up Mormon, it was almost unheard of to have someone that wasn't Mormon in my classroom.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I remember meeting my first friend, or becoming friends with the first person that I had like a cognizant thought of, what, this person doesn't go to church? Wait, I thought everybody in the world goes to church,
I can remember in about 3rd or 4th grade. I lived in Lehigh, very heavily Mormon populated area, of course. And I had a girl in my class. She was the only person in our classroom that was not Mormon. And I remember thinking, but she's so nice. I always heard, you grow up thinking that everyone that doesn't go to church is somehow bad.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they eat babies for their sacrament and whatnot. Yeah. Yeah, and then it's so weird to live somewhere other than Utah now and realize that there are almost no Mormons around. Like, a Mormon is an anomaly anywhere other than Utah. So it's kind of weird to, get that new perspective type of deal.
Yeah, it is interesting.
So I want to ask you, Kaitlyn, then this job now that you're working, you said that it's kind of evolving into a bit of a career just as much as a job. So is this the same job that you got when you first moved out into the world, or where is this now?
So when I first moved back out, I worked in a call center for a little while, and then at about May of 2016, I started this job at this company. In their manufacturing facility, but they needed help with data entry and things in their office. And so I joined on as part of a temp agency to just focus on scanning, filing, basic data entry and things. Well, a week after I started, the guy that did some of the accounting, some of the accounts payable was fired. And so they moved me into his position. Wow. And then about a week after that, my boss, the CFO, comes into my office and she says that they would like to move me into more of an HR role, to become an HR assistant as I go through schooling, and kind of move more into that role. That it was my option, but they would like to groom me to become this HR person. And so I accepted that and so I became the HR assistant. And in the past year, I've gone to 7 different training classes, I think, and about a few different conferences and things. And I've actually now just recently become certified. I'm an APHR, which means Associate Professional in Human Resources. And so, it's grown and I love it. I mean, Very cool. I'm going to school for psychology, and HR and psychology just fit right hand in hand. So it's fantastic.
Oh, for sure. Well, that's so good to hear now that and 2 years ago, you couldn't have said that you were in, this kind of this space now. And 2 years later, here you are. You kind of weathered the storm, and now you're in the real world. You're getting schooling. You're in a career, hopefully moving towards a career path. And this is just really awesome to hear. I hope you don't mind me applying this label to you, Kaitlyn, but all in all, given what happened with your living situation and how things went back in September and October of 15 versus where you are now, granted, you had that GoFundMe and it was very successful, but that was a safety net to get you out into the real world. Now you're out there, you're making a life for yourself, and I think that we can send out a broad thank you to the secular community for creating that safety net, and I think we can label you, Kaitlyn, as a bit of a success story for somebody who was in desperate need of help from the secular community, and they stepped up to the plate and knocked it out of the park, and now you're a happy, functioning adult living on your own. That's just amazing. Is that an okay summation? Are you okay with that label?
I think so, because I would not be where I am today without the secular community. I've seen firsthand the selflessness that the people in this community have, and just the humanist perspective. I mean, I benefited so much. I had so many people just jump feet first without even, thinking of themselves. They just thought, this person needs help, and they jumped into help, and it was fantastic. And so I've seen firsthand how beneficial it was, and how, what's the word I'm thinking of, giving these people are. And it was so incredible to me. I definitely had a lot of help to get to where I am today, and I'm really grateful for that.
That's awesome. And people are, we aren't exactly lone wolves. People just require help sometimes, and being able to identify when we do need help and being able to graciously accept that help when other people are, kind of doing what they can to help in any way, shape, or form, and recognize that somebody like yourself was in that situation. I mean, I think that's really amazing just to see that the secular community really stepped up and made this happen. And I say good on them, good on the whole secular community for it. And, I don't know if there's anybody listening to this right now who may have donated to it. But I'll personally say just, thank you for doing so. And, here is a success story that shows that when somebody is in, a little bit of a rut and needs help, pulling themselves out, they can definitely they can take lemons and make some fantastic lemonade. So I say good job, Kaitlyn. Like, this is really positive to hear.
Well, like I said, I couldn't be where I am right now without the help I got. And so I hate to take credit for it. But I am very grateful, and I applaud that. Thank you, what you said. I agree 100%. Huge thank you to everyone.
Awesome. I want to ask you, Kaitlyn, now that you don't have God to thank for everything in your life, and you don't have a religion that tells you what makes you happy and whatnot, what is it that you find joy in now? What makes Kaitlyn wake up every day?
That's a good question. I think that there are a few things in my life that I have, I'm very grateful to depend on. My boyfriend, Tristan, he is fantastic. He and I, that's a perfect example, waking up, because in the mornings, we're just so completely different people. I mean, I am not a morning person at all. And he is such a huge morning person and just happy and trying to make me laugh and trying to cheer me up. And I mean, that's just a perfect example of his kind of attitude. And he's just always so willing to help me, to support me in my goals and everything. So I'm very grateful to him. I think that, I don't know that I ever had God as a reason to wake up. I think that a reason to wake up is going out and feeling the sunshine and enjoying like a day off or a day to relax in bed if you want to. But I think that God was never the thing that affected whether my day was good or not. And I don't think I realized that always. And I don't think I ever really thought, oh man, I'm so grateful that God made me happy today, because you create your own happiness. And I've learned that a lot throughout my life and throughout my battle with mental illness, that you kind of have to create your own happiness and find what makes you happy and what encourages you and what drives you, and find your passions, find your hobbies. And sometimes you need a little help with creating that happiness, but it's always there for you to put together, and it's always individual. Very well said.
Yeah, and obviously having somebody to share that with you. I met Tristan back at a meetup that we did. I think this was about a year ago at this time. Maybe not quite that long. And Tristan did seem like a very, positive, happy person. And it seems like you guys are very happy together. And it just goes to show that, you don't exactly need, you don't need a religion or a middleman somewhere in a relationship in order to make that relationship happy. And obviously you two work very well together and support each other and help each other. And I think that's maybe the most important thing that has helped you transition through this, is having somebody that you can lean on.
Oh, absolutely. Way. Absolutely. I would not have been able to make it throughout my transition, throughout all this stuff that went down with my family without him by my side. It was fantastic. My parents said to me once, and it just blew my mind. They said that they love God more than they love each other. And I just can't fathom that, because I can't imagine anyone that I could love more than Tristan.
Wow. That's just amazing. So, Kaitlyn, I want to thank you for coming on today. I don't want to take up too much more of your time here. I just wanted to follow up and do this discussion today, because I think it's important, to fulfill things that I say that I'm going to do on the podcast, and B, to kind of catch up and see just where you are and where, people who are initially at some point in a state of flux, seeing how they've come to stabilize. And I think, like I said, you're a great poster child for what the secular community can really pull off if they unite together and push towards one cause. So, Kaitlyn, thank you so much for joining me today. And if people happen to want to reach out to you to talk to you about how you transitioned, or maybe people are in kind of a similar state, is there somewhere where people can get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can. I mean, I'm on Facebook. Always add me on Facebook or Twitter. You can add me on Twitter. My username is Kate Kenna, KAITKENNA. You just those two platforms. If they can get into contact with you and you send them my way, absolutely. But yeah, I love to talk to anyone that wants to ask me anything or needs some help or just someone to listen to them.
Very cool. And of course, there will be links to those in the show notes for anybody who is interested in chasing that down. Kaitlyn, thank you so much for joining me. This has really been a pleasure today.
Yeah, thank you, Bryce. It was good to talk to you again.
All right, that will do it for the main portion of today's episode. Once again, thank you, Kaitlyn, for coming on. It was really a pleasure to talk to you and kind of follow up on our previous conversation. So I do have a couple of other things to get to. First off, I want to announce to everybody, this episode you're listening to right now doesn't have a Patreon segment added into it. It's just a regular episode. But if you are a supporter on Patreon, you can go check the feed, and I would recommend checking it out this week because Marie and I decided to jump on the podcasting bandwagon of reviewing really shitty movies. And we decided to kick it off with a movie called Time or Eternity. A movie produced in the late 1960s by BYU with the stamp of approval from the Quorum of the 12. And we just, we describe it, discuss it, make fun of it, and have a really good time. And we have decided to debut it as frackin' bad movies, because what better way to pay homage to Mormonism and Mormon cinema than invoking fracking? So if you are a supporter on Patreon, I would really recommend checking out that episode. We had a ton of fun, and we really hope to do more of these in the future. Maybe do one of them per month or something to that effect. I really haven't talked about this to Marie to see if we're going to try and systematize this at all. But we did have quite a bit of fun, and we are also looking for any suggestions out there. If any of you want to hear us lampoon or make fun of a really terrible old Mormon movie or even a newer Mormon movie, let us know. Send it to us in an email at nakedmormonism@gmail.com or at comments at mybookofmormonpodcast.com. We would love to get in some suggestions just to see if there are some other videos out there other than these old, hard-to-find Mormon videos. So that's one thing. Just a brief announcement about that. I really hope you guys do enjoy that for those who are supporters on Patreon. And if you're not, pledge to support. You can support for as little as a penny an episode. I would prefer, $1 or $2 an episode, but a penny an episode will get you access to all of the Patreon content, and there's special content every week there. Sometimes extra episodes, sometimes extra reading. There's ton of extra content on the Patreon feed. So with that being said, there was an email that I wanted to get to, and this came in the form of a question from John. And I'll just read his email briefly, and it was in response to the episode with Mark Noggle. And he says, just listened to your interview with Mark Noggle, episode 62, and I came away puzzled. You and Mark are obviously highly energized about the Quit Mormon project, but to this never-mo, referring to himself, I can't understand what could possibly induce me to spend time and energy trying to get my name removed from the records of a church, much less use an attorney to do so. I recognize from the way you conversed that for many ex-mos it is worth it, but when I walked away from my boyhood church, I simply didn't look back. I didn't expect that church to delete my records. I was publicly a member. I didn't bother to ask Kiwanis or Sierra Club or the local Polar Bear Club to remove me from their records after I stopped affiliating with them either. I am an inactive or former member of dozens of clubs and organizations, and it doesn't bother me in the least that one of them happens to be a church. So I'm missing something going into the podcast, and I expect there could be a few of us nevermos out there who might be missing the same thing. Perhaps I have to have been a Mormon to understand the profound relief you and Mark were talking about. But at the end of the interview, I was left wondering why the Quit Mormon project even needs to exist. And first off, I'll just say, John, thank you for sending that email, and I hope you don't mind if I use your first name in this. And in my reply to him, I basically just said, people feel really dragged down by being a member of the church. And the way that I want to illustrate this is by drawing an analogy, right? if you become, let's say you are raised up in a very bigoted family, right? You don't know anything about the world as a child, but you are dragged to KKK rallies by your parents. And of course, this is an extreme example. Take that for what it's worth. But you're dragged to these KKK rallies. You're taught that minorities are a horrible thing and they're a cancer to society, and that the only way to make America great again is by excising them from our population, or by disparaging them, or by relegating them through segregation, whatever the case may be. And then let's say after going through this very insular upbringing without any sort of views from the outside coming in to penetrate your mind, you're a dues-paying member of this KKK organization, of this Grand Dragon of, let's say, Pennsylvania or something like that. I'm just using it as an example. But then let's say you go off to a semester in college in California, and you befriend some people who are Jewish or black or Mexican or some version of minority that you previously were rallying against, that you previously were holding up signs and wearing the coat and the hat and everything because you were taught all your life that these were bad people, or you were taught some form of ideology that you now realize is wrong once you're introduced to new ideas, once you are able to break out of that echo chamber that you had been raised in. Would you be okay with that KKK club, once you leave and no longer pay dues to them, using your name on their rolls to bolster their numbers? Let's say after this comes down, the KKK comes under political scrutiny, and they say, well, we have X million number of members that we pull from and we draw support from, and we have this much political clout. We are able to affect this much change because we have this many people who are following us. And your name is actually included and invoked in that. They are using your name in vain to accomplish their agenda. Would you be okay with that? Now that you're more educated and you don't any longer subscribe to those bigoted or antiquated ideals. So that's an extreme example, but it kind of gets to the same foundation, right? Once people have been raised in the church, or they are a member of the church, or, convert or whatever, and their names go on the roll, they feel like once they deconvert, once they kind of rewash their brain from the brainwashing that had happened, and they're able to see the Mormon church from the outside and see it for what it really is, and see the bigotry and the political agenda that it's constantly forwarding, people often aren't okay with that. They don't want their name to be attributed or included in that 15 million number that the church claims. More than that, too, it's also a form of peaceful protest. When you're a member of an organization that is doing something you don't like, what do? You can stop attending, you can stop giving them your tithing money, and they'll feel that kind of in the long run. But a more abrasive way to protest them in a peaceful way is by saying, you can't use my name for your agenda anymore. You can't include me as a member of your club anymore, and I am actively exerting my will to disconnect myself from you and your agenda. So a lot of Mormons feel that the church's agenda and what the church does about their history or doesn't do about their history, and the kind of lies of omission that they frequently embrace in order to obfuscate some of the skeletons that lie in their closet. Many people feel that the church is somehow betraying their trust when they had given their entire life and trust to the church when they converted or when they grew up in it or whatever the case may be. So feeling that betrayal, this is one of the only ways that we can protest the church's actions without going to the lengths of, going and standing on their lawn with picket signs every Sunday or something to that effect. And most ex-Mormons aren't going to do that. Most ex-Mormons don't care. But that weight is still on their shoulders oftentimes. When people do leave the church and they realize that their name is still on the rolls, they may feel like the church is using that influence, and they don't want that. So oftentimes when they do send in their resignation letter, it does feel like, as Mark and I discussed, it feels like a weight has been lifted off their shoulders. Like they have a kind of a new license on life. Like nobody is able to say that they are a member of this club who has a certain bigoted political agenda that they constantly spend millions on lobbying for, on lobbying in order to accomplish. So I can understand how, John, being an Evermo, it's kind of hard to empathize with that. And any type of analogy, even with the extremist most analogy I can think of with a KKK group, even that doesn't really capture kind of the feeling of it. And most of the time when people do send in their resignation letter, they are doing so based on the motivations that are feeling driven. They are frustrated. They are angry with the church. And this is the only way that they can protest it. So it does feel like a sweet relief, I think, for a lot of people when they get it off, or get their resignation letter back, or their confirmation letter back, I should say. So, and I would say if you do want to kind of get a glimpse into how people feel when they do get their confirmation letter in return from the church, and the confirmation letters just say, in accordance with your request, the records for this person have been removed from the church rolls. Now, there's no way to tell if they actually have, but it is important to note that letter, some people getting that letter back, they post a picture of it with their name blotted out on Reddit and say, I finally got mine. I'm so happy, or my wife and I just resigned, or, people are euphoric and elated that they have taken this action in protest of the church's stances. So, it's kind of hard to instill empathy and an understanding about how it feels. Just go check the ex-Mormon Reddit. There's a lot of links there, a lot of pictures of people doing that very thing. It doesn't take long for those to aggregate. So, yeah, but that was a really good email, John, and it kind of forced me to, I guess, elucidate my thoughts about this on air, and I appreciate that very much. So thank you for sending in that email, John. I also do need to add somebody who I'm actually friends with, a listener of the show, N.A., I think N.A. is all that he wants to be addressed by, commented that when he had his name removed from the church, well, let me just read this. This is actually from the Patreon feed, where he left this link, and it's in, each episode on Patreon has their own comment section on it. But this is what NA said. He said, quote, "When I resigned my membership in April 2008, it took until February of 2009 to receive a confirmation letter. When I was rebaptized in 2012, I learned my name simply got an X next to it. The names remain. At least that's my experience. Although I didn't go through Quit Mormon, I just put a note in the mailbox at my local ward asking to please remove my name." And I think that goes to something that Mark and I were talking about. And I think I introduced it by saying, this is my conspiracy brain asking this question, but do they actually take the names off of their rolls, or do they just move them to another file on the computer or something? And Mark said, I have no idea whatsoever. And, hearing from NA's, his experience, I think this leads me to believe that maybe those suspicions could be correct, that they don't actually remove those names from their rolls. They just put them in a different folder. They just put an X next to it or an asterisk next to the record and say this person requested to be removed, or this person is an inactive member, or whatever the case may be. So, but there's obviously no way to know there's no way to audit the church's membership numbers. They keep them pretty tight under wraps. I mean, there's no way to audit the money that they spend. So why would there be a way to audit who is and is not a member of the church? So yeah, that was just an interesting addition that I wanted to include in the conversation. So yeah, thanks for commenting on that Patreon thread there, NA. All right, we do have a couple of new patrons to thank. Looks like we have Tim Heaton, who just pledged. Thank you very much for that, Tim. He and I have exchanged emails quite a bit in the past, so thank you for that pledge. And we also have Matthew Maxon, who pledged. Now, Matthew is the host of the Odd Atheist Friends podcast, and he just aired his episode where I went on the show to talk with him and his co-host. The episode is episode 15, Look at My Penis, with Bryce Blankenagel. So that was a really fun episode. Check the show notes for a link to that. And if you do want to listen to Matthew Maxon's podcast, Odd Atheist Friends, I recommend it. He also has No Illusions on recently, Andrew Torres recently, Molly Unmormon. He's got a whole pantheon of people who are much better podcasters than I. So, yeah, be sure to give that a listen if you want to hear us just bullshitting about what random things here and there, about the church, about politics, about a number of things. But that does it for today. We are planning on doing a Mormon Leaks Minute next week. We have so much to talk about with Ryan. If you're keeping up with MormonLeaks.io, there are some very interesting documents which have recently been released, both leaks and non-leaks. I guess the non-leak that I want to discuss with him is the 316-page manifesto that they released about public records of child abuse being covered up in the church. And we're hoping to discuss that a little bit, and we will be discussing maybe a couple of other things as well. So be sure to tune into next week's episode, and we'll get into another Mormon Leaks Minute segment. With that, we are all done for the evening. Thank you so much to Julie for posting up in the Facebook and Twitter pages and keeping conversation going there. If you want to follow along and hear all of the newest updates about the show, that's the place to find our public presence. Thank you to Craig Keeling for providing the artwork used in the show with his permission. Be sure to go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog there. Music in this show is provided by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com. Thank you for that. Also, the law offices of P. Andrew Torres are the legal counsel for this show. Keep us out of trouble. Opening Arguments podcast with Thomas Smith and Andrew Torres. It's a really, really good show. They keep things topical, interesting, and they release shows 2 times a week. Of course, thank you so much to the patrons who keep this show going. Just a heads up, I am right now in the planning phases of the logistics of putting together a trip out to Mythicist, Milwaukee at the end of September, as well as the John Whitmer History Association Conference. So we'll be including details of that coming up in the near future. Most of all, thank you to the wondiferously beautiful listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.
can't talk as fast as you and Dr. Legner.
Jen,
But
you're so naive, and I love it. Marry me, Jan.
And Dr. Legner says, well, the no-God people say that it doesn't need to be proved.
The no-God people.
You can't say atheist?
They can't even say the word atheist. They can't even let it form their mouth. It's like Voldemort. No, it's the people who cannot be named. Those no-God people.
Yes. Find your own creepy specimens. And she's like grabbing crabs. I'm like, what? Who is she even talking to? What is happening here?
Interesting note, the first scene that we get is her on Earth getting crabs. Just, that's not a great way to enter existence. I'm just saying.
How did I not put that together? Jan, you have crabs. What have you been doing?
Right? The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.